Good morning, APUSH. Happy Wednesday. Yesterday, you guys did a period 2 practice with working on our short answer questions. So today we are going to transition into period 3 and working on review of the content for period 3 so that way we can launch practice for the next 2 days. So make sure you have paper and a pen nearby so that way you can take notes during this quick review lecture. While you are doing that, I'm going to share my screen and get our PowerPoint set up. Great, I'll give you one more minute. Make sure you have those materials nearby so that way you can properly take notes and get all of the information that you need that is necessary in order to complete the in-class classwork today. Great, so today we are going to look through period 3 utilizing some signature dates that have to be known. So when you are organizing these notes, please make sure you are highlighting the key dates that I am mentioning because these are essential time periods where knowing the exact year and information that is associated with the year matters a lot. So we are going to start with 1763. Specifically looking at the Proclamation of 1763. So the French and Indian War is happening, and it finishes up in 1763. It goes from 1754 to 1763. And the French and Indian War directly leads to the Proclamation line of 1763, which is a new line set up where the British colonies, or the British power, specifically limits where the British colonies can expand in their treaty or understanding with the Native American tribes of the area. So before there was this understanding that these white settlers felt that they were entitled to spread as far west as they deemed possible. But this proclamation line of 1763, the British specifically state you can no longer go past this line due to a treaty. The end of the French and Indian War isn't just the proclamation line of 1763, it is also the launch of new taxes. The French and Indian War puts the British Empire in a mass amount of debt. And so they need to figure out how to subsidize this income. And a lot of that subsidizing comes from taxing the colonists through things like the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and the Tea Act. And what the proclamation line and these taxes specifically represent is the end of salutary neglect. As you guys remember, salutary neglect is this idea that the British are just going to ignore the colonists and allow them to govern themselves however they like, as long as they're still good British citizens and they do what is necessary for the British crown. They're just going to leave them alone and let them do what they want. However, with these taxes and the limit of where they can spread, this is an official end of salutary neglect, where the British crown begins to involve themselves in the colonists' lives more and more. These things split the colonists into two groups. You have the loyalists on one side, and loyalists are colonists that are loyal to the British crown regardless of these taxes and these limitations. And on the other side, you have the patriots. The patriots are American citizens who are actively trying to resist these new taxes and this proclamation line. So the resistance, again, is run by the patriots, and it comes in several, and this resistance comes in several different modes. You have one, the creation of groups like the Sons of Liberty, who are actively working to push for the colonists' interests, and they are doing so in more active measures through protests and things of that nature. Two, you have the Continental Congress established as a way to push for more understanding and more focus on the role or protections of the colonists. And thirdly, one of the most notable events is the Boston Tea Party, where colonists board English ships and throw their tea overboard as a form of protest against the Tea Act specifically. The next date we are going to specifically focus on is 1776, with the writing of the Declaration of Independence. It's important to understand that the Declaration of Independence does not come out of nowhere. There are a lot of different things that are leading to colonists' desire or understanding that they can, in fact, govern themselves. One of those is the pervasiveness of Enlightenment ideas in the colonists, this idea of life, liberty, and property, which will turn in the Declaration into the pursuit of happiness. And these John Locke ideas of natural rights or natural liberties that every person, every white male at this time period was entitled to. You also have the First Great Awakening occurring in the colonies from like the 1720s to the 1740s, where colonists are more willing to question power structures, specifically of religion and politics. In the colonists, you have different governing bodies like the Virginia House of Burgesses or the Mayflower Compact, where the colonists do not look to the British Crown for governing, they look to themselves. And all of these different things help inspire the Declaration of Independence, where again we see this idea of natural rights and this, and specifically the disapproval of the British governing system, and this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness being something that the colonists are willing to fight and die for. And they do with the American Revolution. As we know, the American Revolution happens from 1776 to 1781, where colonists go against the British and fight for their independence. And to the surprise of the entire world, they win. This is the first time that a colony ever successfully rebels and gains their independence from a mother country. And they officially win the American Revolution in 1781, which leads to the need to learn how to govern themselves and set up a new governing system in place now that they were independent. Which leads us to our next date, 1787, in the Constitutional Convention. The American Revolution ends in 1781, and we don't have the Constitutional Convention until 1787. So what is happening in those 6 years? The biggest and most important thing that is happening at that time period is the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation is the governing document that is the first attempt at democracy and representative government in the colonies, now the United States. And the Articles of Confederation has a very weak federal power. It does not allow for an executive body in the federal government, so there is no president. And because there is no true central power, the United States does not have the ability to tax or raise armies, which is very, very problematic, especially when we end up in Shays' Rebellion. What's important to know about Shays' Rebellion is this is what highlights and pushes forward the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation to the point that the Founding Fathers say, okay, we need to rethink our system of government in order to make sure we have our country as set up for success as possible. Which leads us to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. The nickname of the Constitution is that it is a bundle of compromises. You have different states with different agendas, and a lot of whom are very concerned about a central power because they just overthrew a monarchy. And so they're afraid of replicating that in their new government. Some of the more notable compromises are the 3/5 Compromise, which gives Southern states representation that includes their slaves. So you have the North arguing, if you say that they're just property, why should you get representation for them? And the South pushing to have them counted for representation so that way they can have more representation in the House of Representatives. And so you end up with a compromise of, for every 5 slaves, we will count 3 of them towards your population. You also have the Great Compromise, which is the decision to create a legislative branch that is compiled of two groups. You have the House of Representatives that is based off of population, and you have the Senate, which is based off of states. So every state has 2 senators, but the amount of representatives that they have is based off of population. During the Constitutional Convention, we see a debate between 2 primary groups. On one side, you have the Federalists, who are in support of a strong federal government. So they would rather have a strong central power. Some of the most famous Federalists are Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, and despite never being a public Federalist, many see George Washington as a Federalist. He does attempt to stay neutral, although he definitely leans Federalist. And on the other side, you have the Anti-Federalists. And the Anti-Federalists are pro-state power. And these Anti-Federalists tend to be from the South, whereas the Federalists tend to be from the North. There are, of course, disparities in that, but that's just a generalization. And the Anti-Federalists also push for the creation of a Bill of Rights, where individual rights are explicitly laid out in the Constitution as a way to protect them. Some of the most famous Anti-Federalists at this time are James Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Although Thomas Jefferson is not present at the Constitutional Convention, most of his feelings are represented by his friend James Madison. Which leads us to our next important date, 1800, the election of Thomas Jefferson. Washington in 1789 was unanimously elected to be the president of the United States. He's the only person to ever get that. And it sets a lot of precedents. So he's the president that creates precedents about how a president should run the government. He is the reason why most presidents, up until there was the amendment, only ran for 2 terms, because Washington ran for 2 terms. You also have, he also sets up a cabinet, which is basically a group of advisors that specifically are in charge of different aspects of the government. In his first cabinet, Thomas Jefferson is the Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton is the Secretary of the Treasury. Those 2 people you need to know, and specifically Thomas Jefferson's role in Washington's presidency. They have a lot of debates specifically over the role of the federal government, and a lot of this culminates in Hamilton's desire to create a national bank. Washington and Hamilton believe it is in the federal government's power to create a national bank, whereas Thomas Jefferson argues that because it's not explicitly in the Constitution as a federal power, it is not the federal government's right to do so. This is another thing that we see Washington do, is through his presidency, he takes opportunities to really solidify the type of power that a federal government has. So a lot of decisions that he makes are what we see as having presidential powers, even though it's not explicitly laid out in the Constitution. And again, one of the most important things that comes out of Washington's presidency is his decision to leave after 2 terms. He could have remained president until his death. However, he understood that letting things go and showing that somebody should relinquish power after 8 years was going to be the most important thing for this government. And so in his farewell address, he sets up 2 main ideas that we've discussed a lot. One is, do not create political parties, do not create partisanship. And 2, remain isolationists. We are not a country that is prepared at the time to involve ourselves in foreign affairs. So be sure to stay as neutral as possible. Washington is succeeded by his vice president, John Adams, who is another Federalist. And John Adams barely wins. It's between him and Jefferson. And if it wasn't for John Adams having the endorsement of Washington, he wouldn't have won. John Adams is not as commanding a leader as Washington. And he has a couple missteps in his one term as president that really showcase the limits of his presidency. One, and the thing he is the most infamous for, so famous in a bad way, are the Alien and Sedition Acts, which limit free speech. So in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, it is explicitly laid out that we have the right to freedom of speech, and John Adams limits that, specifically limiting free speech against his presidency. So if you were writing negative things about the president himself, you could be arrested. And so that made him quite unpopular. We then see in the election of 1800, it is between John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Aaron Burr. And because of different endorsements, Jefferson wins the presidency in 1800 under the political party, the Democratic Republicans. Next week, we are going to go into Thomas Jefferson's presidency, but it is in the election of 1800 that we see this transition into a peaceful transition of power. So Thomas Jefferson is a Democratic Republican. John Adams and Washington were both Federalists. So with this peaceful transition to a different political party, we see something new in the United States that has not been practiced before. That is it in terms of the content for today's lecture. You are going to have an extended oral drill and a shorter class packet for today. So be sure to take your time on your oral drill and most of the terms we have covered today. So please take your time with that. Use your resources as necessary. I look forward to seeing you guys on Zoom. Remember, you need to check in order to get a quiz grade at the end of this week. I look forward to seeing you guys and talking through this really fun stuff. I've been listening to Hamilton basically every single day for the last 2 weeks. So I'm a little fired up on the Founding Fathers right now. So I'm excited to talk about this stuff with you guys. I will see you guys on Zoom, and please let me know if you have any questions.